Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is, I hope, I mean, it definitely has the same spirit to it as the motion, the amendment that was just defeated of CPC 7. As we heard from numerous witnesses and groups advocating for the rights of the disabled and calling for a barrier-free Canada, there's tremendous disappointment in this bill for its lack of timelines and for the notion of progressive realization of a Canada without barriers. To remind you of some of the testimony, as Dr. Pare, who was a contributor to the United Nations Handbook for Parliamentarians, mentioned, a term like progressive realization has its place in international law to facilitate consensus, but is quite, I'll just quote her, I find the reference to progressive realization acceptable only if it is tied to a timeline or something else tangible. And of course, David Lepofsky from the AODA Alliance has been very clear that progressive realization within this bill could mean that we don't see a barrier-free Canada for a very long time. So my amendment here in Partie Verte 3 is to insert within the mandate of the minister and following as part of the minister after the subclause on powers, a new clause 3 under section 11 to ensure that the minister must prepare a plan to set out these objectives, and the plan must be ready within 10 years after the section comes into force, and the plan must be prepared within 1 year after the day when the section comes into force. So again, it creates a 1-year timeline to develop objectives so that the objectives are achieved within 10 years of the bill coming into force.
Thanks, Ms. May. Mr. Nuttall.
So, Mr. Chair, I just have a question for the mover of the motion, just to confirm. So as of today, in what decade will we reach a barrier-free Canada?
This would depend on when the bill enters into force, but assuming it entered into force in 2019, it would come into the barrier-free Canada objectives should be met by 2028.
But without your amendment, is that still the case?
No.
So, just to be clear, we don't have a defined timeline on when we're trying to reach the goals of which this bill is advocating.
As it now stands, and this was one of the consistent criticisms of the legislation, good intentions, but without a timeline. As I recall, one comment, progressive realization of a barrier-free Canada could be one disability ramp installed somewhere in Canada once a year. And that would get us a barrier-free Canada sometime in the next few centuries.
Maybe.
Ms. Falk.
I just wanted to add for the record too, without having a timeline, and we heard this countless times throughout testimony, is how do we measure? How do we measure? How do we hold either the department or the government accountable? Because there's no way to measure that. So I think that it is so important, and I mean, we've heard from our stakeholders loud and clear that it is important to have timelines in this bill. That's all.
Thanks, Ms. Falk. Mr. Diot.
Yeah, I would certainly concur with that. Really, it's a bit of an insult to all the people who testified here and who called out for timelines that we wouldn't adhere to such a very, very basic thing as to include a timeline when we would become accessible. So it's an absolute must.
Mr. Rumi.
Very quickly, we actually heard quite a few different things. We heard different types of timelines. But speaking to Mrs. May's progressive, we're actually removing the word progressive realization. We're removing that anyways. But there was a lot of testimony that also spoke to an evolution to get to where we need to go because it's ongoing. So that's part of the challenge right now. It's lots of people talked about timelines, but they weren't specific, and they were for both sides.
Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have to respectfully disagree with my honorable colleague. When people were presenting the idea of how this was going to evolve, it was because we knew that just by the very nature of it, that there are going to be innovations and new ways that we're increasingly removing barriers to participation for people living with all these different abilities, and we're going to find them. That's what the whole point was. Without some kind of a timeline here, there's no impetus for this to actually move forward. So unless there is an amendment coming from my colleagues on the governing side moving further on, this is our chance right now. And 10 years is extremely reasonable to reach certain objectives or mile markers. And that's what we need. In order for this bill to be, to pass, to be tabled, we've got to hit the ground running to make certain markers hit by a certain timeline. Otherwise, we know what will happen. Nothing. We'll just keep moving without a deadline. And the deadline doesn't have to be the stop dead, drop dead deadline. This is that marker where you hit certain objectives and then you move forward from that. And I understand the conundrum about using about having realization, but if we use the word realization rather than progressive realization, it still doesn't do the job for us that we need, which is something that is more defined in terms of where we're going to meet certain objectives at a certain period of time. And this is a very reasonable period of time. A decade is very reasonable.
Mr. Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that there's a fundamental issue here that I believe Mr. Rumi has heard me talk about at a different committee, which is targets and goals and measurement. And the problem right now is if it's left as is, the only measurement that we will have in place is actually the amount of money spent. And so if a plan doesn't have a kind of a threshold in terms of the timeline when it should be achieved by, it will keep going on forever and ever and ever. And I would actually really ask my Liberal colleagues around this table to consider this, that the reality is that if you don't have a timeline, those measurements are not actually in place for you as Liberals. They're actually in place for the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada can be comprised of many, many, many different iterations. You know, we don't know what the next government looks like. We don't know what the government after that looks like. You know, in 6 years, it could be the Communist Party of Canada could be forming the Government of Canada. And at that point, there's not a continuation of maybe the goodwill that's sitting in your caucus. But what you do want is that goodwill to be legislated in order that that work is actually continued. And if it's not going to be met, not going to be continued, then they should have to change it legislatively and then report back to the people of Canada and be held accountable for that change in direction. Right now, they could just walk away and not do anything, throw their hands in the air. And you know what? Nothing's gotten actually achieved. And what was the purpose of the bill in the first place? And that's actually the problem we've heard from stakeholders over and over again. I wasn't at a committee the whole time, but I definitely met with quite a number of stakeholders who are all saying there's just not enough teeth, there's not enough detail, there's not enough telling us when and how this is going to be instituted. Sorry, I apologize, I'm doing it again. There's not enough detail, and there's not enough teeth to determine when and how everything that's outlined in this bill is actually going to be achieved. So if it's not 10 years, when? You know, I think that's the question, that if it's unreasonable that the Green Party, the New Democrats, the Conservatives are all saying 10 years. If that's not a reasonable thing to vote for, then how long is it? Is it 15? Is it 20 years? Is it 100 years? What's the number? Because there has to be one in order to ensure accountability, not just for this government, but for every successive government in the future.
Thanks, Mr. Nuttall. Ms. Young.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to remind the committee of what Minister Qualtrough had said when she appeared before the committee at the very beginning of this discussion, and she was very concerned about setting timelines. And one of the reasons is because what it really does is it tells people, okay, if there's a 10-year timeline, then we don't have to do anything for 9 years. And the fact of the matter is, we want this to start immediately once the law becomes enacted. And timelines should be part of the regulations, not part of legislation. And I think that will determine any timelines moving forward.
Mr. Nuttall.
The quick question through to Ms. Young. Is it then going to be brought back to Parliament? Your regulations will be brought back to Parliament in order for us to be able to vote on the timelines related to each of the regulatory changes that will be taking place?
No.
So
that
then
would
there's no
not.
accountability.
Appreciate the chance to engage again, Mr. Chair, but in response to Kate's points, that's why I have a double-barreled amendment here. The 10 years doesn't hang out by itself in the abstract. It requires a plan prepared within 1 year. And that plan speaks to achievables over time with a 10-year deadline. It wouldn't be possible, I don't think, without a great deal of political risk for a minister to design a plan that didn't start till year 9. You'd have to design a plan that was going to meet that objective. It's a 10-year objective. You have measurables that you're going to develop for years 1 and 2 and 3 and so forth. And that, I think that is not uncommon in legislation at all. And otherwise, we have something just hanging out there that could fade in the background and waiting for regulations. This is just one example, but Vanessa's law that was passed in the last Parliament still has no regulations attached to it. And here we're waiting to make sure we are reporting symptoms from pharmaceuticals that might be killing people. We still have no regulations, and it's 4 years later. So I don't want to wait for regulations. Honestly, I think members around this table could make a huge contribution to a barrier-free Canada by accepting my amendment, which is then reviewable by Parliament on a regular basis.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Rumi.
A couple of things. We heard from the province of Ontario that had a 10-year time limit, and directly from the witnesses, they were woefully inadequate. They're nowhere close to being where they become barrier-free. And then to other specific, speaking to other specific timelines, we actually do have deadlines that we will be introducing as we move further down. Thank you.
Mr. Diot.
Yeah, just further to that, we heard from David Lepofsky, the chair of Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, and here's some quotes from him. Timelines are needed. The bill is lacking an ultimate deadline for achieving full accessibility. We need an end deadline. Without it, progress will be slower. You've heard it from many groups that have said we need that, and I don't know if you've heard from any groups that said we don't. The only person who's come before this committee, I believe, to make a case against doing that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Minister Qualtrough, who may have said, or someone may have said, well, we don't have a timeline in the criminal code to be crime-free. But Mr. Lepofsky goes on saying that's a wrong comparison. We have a criminal code because we know that unfortunately in our society there will always be violence and so on. We need laws to protect us when that happens. On the other hand, we can achieve full accessibility by a deadline if we set the deadline.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diot. Any further discussion on Green Party 3? Thank you very much. The amendment is defeated. We now move to Green Party 5. Ms. May.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is another attempt, what this does to Clause 18 is add a second section. So in my amendment, Partie vers 5, the following would ensure that there was some degree of a timeline attached to the development of carrying out the mandate and reviewing an accessibility standard, so that to be created, the Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization mandate under Section 1A of the Development and Revision of Accessibility Standards would have that standard within 5 years after. I would have a review the accessibility standards 5 years after the date it was implemented, or on an earlier date if the minister so specified. This is to ensure that as the accessibility standards are rolled out, they're reviewed in a timely fashion to see how they're working and if they're meeting the needs of for which they are designed.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. And I need to be clear as well on the Green Party 5. If adopted, CPC 17 and NDP 4.1 will not be moved due to consistency. Any issue or any discussion on Green Party 5? Mr. Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I would really, really, really like this to be adopted. If we're not going to put actual timelines in place to achieve something, then at least putting timelines in place to report, to review the accessibility makes sense. So if we're not going to put timelines to achieve, hopefully we can have timelines to review, and maybe we can put timelines to achieve at that point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nuttall. Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a very important amendment if we are going to embrace the concept of barrier-free Canada being something that evolves. We need to be responsive, and we need a mechanism in place to ensure that we are responsive as we're evolving and adjusting to best practices and learning and improving constantly, because there is no real end point to all of this. And that point has been made on all sides of the committee table here tonight, and this is extremely important for us to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hardcastle. Any further discussion on Green Party 5? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Hogue.
Ask the experts, in terms of looking at policies and the implementation of policies and the issue of timelines, which has been pretty controversial as we've gone through this, what is the current practice with any legislation you receive in terms of the implementation processes that you follow?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Mr. Chair.
The question is, if there's a piece of legislation that comes out that doesn't have a hard timeline in it, how does the ministry respond to it? How do you carry out the principle? I think we all want to see this as a principle. We want to see this achieved as quickly as possible. If you don't have a timeline, how do you manage that?
If I understand I'm still not sure I understand the question, Mr. Chair, as it pertains to the proposed amendment. As it pertains to the proposed amendment, the Standards Council of Canada already has this requirement. So standards by the accreditation process have to be reviewed every 5 years. That is a requirement. It's already built in. So by creating a new standards organization that will fall under the rules of the Standards Council of Canada, this will already be occurring. It is a, I don't want to overuse the word standard. It is a standard practice. It is a requirement for updating of standards.
So am I?
Yeah, Mr. Hogue.
So does that mean that putting something in this, it becomes redundant because you're bound to that with the standards that you have to comply with now? Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Hogue. Any further comments on this May?
To officials and Mr. Van Ralt, what legal status does the Standards Council of Canada, and we're talking a legislative frame, you mentioned earlier the Human Rights Code, of course, has quasi-constitutional status. There's no statutory status to the council's standards.
It's an accreditation standard.
Yeah, so it's voluntary and outside the laws of Parliament and could be violated without any recourse for parliamentarians to pursue.
I believe that is correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Rolt.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. Any further discussion on Green Party 5? The amendment is defeated.